Marketing strategy. The beginning of the year is a time for planning, so I think it's the perfect moment to talk about strategic planning for the upcoming year. My name is Joanna Mateko, and this is Zoho. Welcome. If your marketing strategy looks great on slides, but in everyday work it actually falls apart, then the problem probably isn't the people or a lack of creativity. Marketing today operates under increasing pressure. On one hand, we have more and more tools. We have artificial intelligence, which is supposed to support the marketing process and make marketing suddenly skyrocket, becoming incredibly creative, full of colorful graphics and creative video material. But is that really happening? Not necessarily. That's because marketing, it's becoming increasingly difficult to translate it into real business results. Strategies are created, campaigns are launched, reports are generated, but somehow it all doesn't translate into real growth. And it's not because someone failed to take care of something. Often, it simply comes down to a lack of infrastructure on which that strategy could actually be based. In practice, it looks like this. Marketing works with its own tools, sales uses different ones, customer service sees something else entirely, and finance handles it according to their own logic. Everyone does their own thing, everyone has their own dashboards and their own definition of success. And then we're surprised that the marketing strategy doesn't work. And that's exactly what today's material will be about. Not about inspiration, not about creative campaigns, and not about a new approach to marketing. We're going to talk about how to build a marketing strategy. That's what we'll be discussing. How to build a marketing strategy as a working system that doesn't operate in silos, is based on shared data, has sensibly chosen KPIs, and is operationally sustainable. Because a strategy is not just a document, it's a way of making decisions, managing data flow, and actually measuring results. In this material, I'll show you how many companies often get lost somewhere along the way, right between planning and execution. And most importantly, we'll talk about how to organize all of this. But before we start talking about building a better marketing strategy, we need to do something much less comfortable. We need to consider where the problem lies and where our strategy is actually falling apart. I'm not talking about evaluating the work, people, or teams. It's about taking an honest look at the way we work, at the data, and at the decisions being made. I recommend asking yourself some very simple questions, but not necessarily comfortable ones, questions that reveal whether the strategy is truly rooted in the organization. The first question is, what real business problems is marketing supposed to solve? Not in theory, not in a presentation, but in practice. Is marketing supposed to increase the quality or quantity, shorten the sales cycle, lower the cost of customer acquisition, or, for example, support upselling? If you get more than 3 answers to this question at once, it's not a strategy, it's just a wish list. A strategy begins when you can clearly define 2 or 3 business goals for which marketing can actually take responsibility. The second question, which might be a bit more difficult. Which KPIs do you report, and to whom? A common problem is that there are actually too many KPIs in companies, but what I really mean is whether the marketing KPIs are consistent with the sales KPIs. Can they be linked to revenue, and does anyone outside of marketing actually consider them credible? Because if marketing reports clicks, leads, or reach, sales looks at pipeline and won deals, and management is interested in revenue and margin, then the problem isn't with reporting, but with the lack of a common data language. And here it's worth asking yourself which of the indicators being reported today actually fulfill business objectives. Another area worth looking at is data. Where does marketing get its data for planning and reporting? Are lead data connected with sales data? Does marketing see what happens to a lead once it's handed over to sales? And does anyone connect campaign data with customer or customer service data? In many companies, the answer is theoretically yes, but unfortunately, this usually means manual exports and different definitions of the same things, concepts, and a lack of a single source of truth. And unfortunately, without consistent data, it's impossible to assess the effectiveness of a strategy. Another important question that's worth asking yourself bluntly. Not just honestly answer, how many marketing tools do we actually use and how many just exist, simply because they were needed at some point and have just stayed there. Because a very common problem isn't a lack of functionality, but actually an excess of tools that don't share a common logic. Each one solves a part of some problem, but unfortunately doesn't support the process as a whole. The result, unfortunately, is that the tools don't support our strategy. And here it's worth taking a short pause and considering whether the real problem is execution or that the strategy doesn't have the conditions it needs to work. We're not looking to assign blame here, but rather to look at the process from the perspective of its effectiveness. Once we take a step back and look at our strategy from a distance, we can move on to the next step, which is aligning goals and building a single shared definition of growth, one that connects marketing with the rest of the organization. And here we'll focus on aligning our goals and making sure the whole company speaks the same language so that everyone understands what growth means and who is actually responsible for what. Let's start with the basics here. The marketing strategy should not operate in isolation from the company's business strategy. This is very important for setting the goals of our activities and analyzing their effectiveness. The problem starts when marketing talks about leads, sales talks about deals, finance talks about margins, and for example, the customer service department talks about customer satisfaction. That's why it's worth asking yourself which indicators truly define business success in the company. Not 12, not 8. It should probably be 3 to 5 at most. It's important that they are understandable, that they actually bring value to the customer, and of course that they are related to revenue, but also achievable. Only then can we truly define the real role of marketing in the company. And this is a very important moment, because too often we think that marketing does everything, but in reality, it doesn't do anything meaningful that actually impacts results. That's why, very often in companies, marketing is treated as an unnecessary cost, as a department that will be the first to face cuts in times of crisis. Because we don't show that it brings real value to the entire organization. Because if marketing, sales, and finance all define the same words completely differently, it doesn't matter. No matter how many reports we create, we'll still be missing a common point of reference. That's why it's so important for the strategy to be not just a marketing presentation, but a document that actually describes what business problem we're solving and which metrics define that success, and what role marketing plays in all of this. If we already have common goals and a shared language, it's worth taking it a step further, because even the best strategy will fall apart if the system is too complicated. Very often the goals are defined, the direction is agreed upon, and yet the strategy still doesn't quite work the way it should. Very often the reason for this is complexity. It stems from ambition, but also from layering over the years more and more processes, more tools, more reports, without asking ourselves what they actually serve and whether they are still relevant. Very often complexity is mistaken for maturity. It's not exactly true that the more tools we have, the more professional we are. Unfortunately, the more tools we have, the more often we lose control over them. Complexity very rarely translates into better decisions. Because in reality, if launching a marketing campaign requires several tools, manual exports, data, some auxiliary spreadsheets, or interpretations that differ depending on the department, the problem isn't the people, but probably the work system. And simplification doesn't mean doing less ambitious things at all. It's simply about creating a single backbone on which all departments operate. So an important step is to take a brutally honest look at all the tools and answer some basic questions. Does this tool support the strategy, and is it part of a larger ecosystem? Because unfortunately, very often tools only address our needs in a very targeted way. We have a separate tool for campaigns, a separate tool for lead generation, and a separate tool for reporting. Each of these tools operates within its own system, but unfortunately, none of them supports the entire process as a whole. And to put it simply, it's not about reducing all tools to a single one that does everything, because such a tool doesn't exist. It's just about reducing the number of places where decisions are made. Another element of simplification is KPI. If we report on many indicators, but no one knows how they are connected or why, then reporting becomes a goal in itself. But in reality, every indicator should lead to some kind of decision. Because if a given KPI doesn't show real progress toward our business goal, then it's really just an informational metric, not a strategic KPI. The next stage of simplification is the way we plan, because unfortunately, a big mistake is that often the marketing plan is very disconnected from the sales plan. And often, unfortunately, in many organizations, these plans don't align at all. and sales and marketing unfortunately work separately from each other. If there is some resistance here within organizations, it's often a very good sign that we're actually touching on areas where there are certain tensions. Now we can move on to the next stage, which is execution. This plan should truly be anchored in our business objectives and realistically mapped out over the 12 months of our operations. I'm not talking here about predicting everything in advance. What's also important are mechanisms and adjustments that allow us to react and change the plan, for example, when it becomes too expensive. Because every marketing initiative should be tied to a business outcome. For example, if the business goal is upselling, then marketing activities should actually focus on achieving that specific goal. So this is absolutely fundamental. If we want to focus, for example, on sales in a certain area, then marketing should support that particular area. That's why it's such a key element to actually oversee this strategy. If something changes, if our business goals change, we should make adjustments on an ongoing basis, and marketing should consciously operate in the areas that are meant to increase the effectiveness of our business goals and activities. If we now take a step back and look at this whole process, it's worth noting one thing. The problem very often arises when a company operates on different systems, because unfortunately, even the best designed strategy will have trouble being implemented if it operates on scattered data. If we operate on a dozen or so tools that don't work together and can't see each other, in other words, if marketing, sales, customer service, or finance are all working from completely different sources of truth. And here, very often, a mistake can occur. Instead of simplifying the process, we add more tools and build yet another point-to-point integration, instead of tying everything together into a single whole. And that's why very often in companies, the problem isn't a lack of something, like marketing tools, but unfortunately that these tools are not part of a single unified ecosystem, because marketing automation operates separately, CRM operates separately, analytics is somewhere else entirely, and all this data has to be manually pieced together somehow to see the whole picture. Meanwhile, the strategy I'm talking about today requires one assumption, namely a shared data backbone for the entire organization. And this is exactly where Zoho comes in. Not just as another marketing tool, but as an entire ecosystem for the organization. We work there on unified data, connecting sales, marketing, customer service, and other departments, which finally have a single source of truth. And in fact, this is the solution, not just for marketing, but for the entire organization, where marketing is meant to function as part of a single growth mechanism. Also, unfortunately, very often the marketing strategy doesn't work. Not because it's poorly designed, but because it operates in an environment that isn't built for collaboration and doesn't support joint decision-making. Zoho is not only a consistent, but also a more affordable alternative, not just for marketing, but for the entire company. That's why the main message of today's episode is that marketing doesn't have to be louder. It doesn't have to be more complicated. It just needs to be properly designed. And good design starts with the system itself. If you're interested and would like to learn more about Zoho implementations, we invite you to get in touch with us. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and of course, LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. See you next time.